Ooh, I'm nervous about this one. This video was sparked by the article in the New York Times called The Death of the Literary Man, as well as by a comment on my video about Sally Rooney, which was decrying the lack of books by young white working class men, saying that working class men could only get published if they were writing about the immigrant experience. The article claims that over the past 2 decades, literary fiction has become an overwhelmingly female pursuit. And that is because women dominate the publishing industry and they won't publish men. And that it is this lack of published literature by men that has pushed them into voting for Donald Trump and supporting Andrew Tate. I'm not even exaggerating. Obviously, to some extent, articles like this are rage bait, meant to wind up the feminist-minded women, which has clearly worked, or I wouldn't be making this video. My first response to articles like this is often, is this even true? Is this just some sort of cancel culture backlash? I mean, I know I have read good literary fiction by men in the last 5 years, and my other reaction is, if it is true, who cares? Does it really matter that women are writing more fiction than men, or that women novel writers are more famous than male ones? Is it really that big of an issue? But I do think that writers of articles like this one are expecting to be dismissed by people like me, young white women, like those that make up the majority of the publishing industry. And so instead, I think that maybe it would be better to come at the topic from curiosity rather than combat. So I'm going to make an attempt to be even-handed with this idea right after I rip into the article itself. The article is doing some fairly fancy footwork with the facts and definitely cherry-picking the data that it uses. He starts off by limiting our discussion on writing to literary fiction, a genre which is not the widest read by any means, and there is a certain snobbishness to the exclusion of genre fiction. I went to look at the bestseller chart several times during the making of this video, from when I first had the idea up until the point that I'm talking to you now, and it definitely has changed several times whilst looking at the ones on Waterstones and on Amazon. Sometimes there were a lot of men in those lists and sometimes less so. So it's definitely not a consistent or easy to use example or data points. What I did notice was oftentimes that genre fiction, such as sci-fi and thrillers and historical fiction even, were more male-dominated than the more general fiction section. And if you excluded romantasy from fantasy, there were a lot more men too. And non-fiction was always dominated by men, at least when I was looking. I read several articles like the one I'm referring to in research in preparation for this video, and the ones in 2018 and 2021 both said that men were still dominating the fiction bestsellers. So it's clearly a fairly new phenomenon of women dominating. If it is true and consistent at all, it seems to me that it's in flux. So while the top 20 bestsellers on Amazon last year were mostly women, although many of them were the same women, multiple books in the series, such as A Court of Thorns and Roses, it doesn't seem to be consistent. And just having that happen one year, I wouldn't say is a very good example of it being a trend. In the third paragraph, he says, in 2022, the novelist Joyce Carol Oates wrote on Twitter that a friend who is a literary agent told me that he cannot even get editors to read first novels by young white male writers, no matter how good. Now, this is a Twitter post from someone saying that a friend told them something. And so it's an unnamed, unsupported anecdote. And I once had a friend who found razor blades in her Halloween chocolate. And even if someone did say that to Joyce Carol Oates, it is a political comment from a specific perspective. No matter how good is a subjective statement. I've had people argue to me that maybe the gender pay gap is because men are just more productive in their jobs than women. Maybe people aren't publishing this literary agent's men books because they're just not very good. Maybe that's not particularly fair, but no one knows who he is. No one knows what the books we're talking about actually are. And there's no proof that the reason they're not being read is because they are by men. And even if it is true, even if that is true, and this agent has experienced people not wanting to read his debut novels by men because they are men, that is one agent talking to one writer one time. So it is a vague statement that is hard to debunk, and it is a specific anecdote meant to prove a broad claim about the publishing industry in general. And it is also interesting that he specifies white men specifically, when we know from the data that publishing is still an overwhelmingly white industry. In 2016, only one debut novel written by a black man was published in the UK. And a 2019 study from the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society found that 94% of authors are white, despite white people only making up 87% of the UK population. It's impossible to fact check an anecdote because the agent isn't named and we can't see into conversations like this behind the scenes anyway, which is why anecdotes are weak data, and the data doesn't support this anecdote. There is also a feeling of conspiracy that I'm not sure I particularly like in this, that there is a shadowy cabal of women editors refusing to publish men. I'm not sure it stacks up with the evidence that we actually have. So our writer of this article then says, "To be clear, I welcome the end of male dominance in literature. Men ruled the roost for far too long, too often at the expense of great women writers who ought to have been read instead," which is really evident by the fact that he's writing this article. He then goes on to blame the fact that men only make up 43% of published authors for the election of Donald Trump and the rise of Andrew Tate, saying that it's because men have been marginalized from contemporary culture, which is why they're making more and more Marvel films and adapting every video game for the screen. Why, when the Brit Awards removed gendered artist categories from the best artist, men dominated the nominations. Why the Joe Rogan podcast is the highest rated podcast in the world. Culture just isn't made for straight men anymore. I think we can see perhaps the proportional decline of male published writers and the rise of Andrew Tate as linked in different ways. Perhaps because 80% of the reading population is female, men aren't writing, and men are involved in the rise of a manosphere for similar reasons. They don't like women very much. Our author says, "Young men have regressed educationally, emotionally, and culturally. Among women matriculating at four-year public colleges, about half will graduate 4 years later. For men, the rate is under 40%. Now, again, 40 and 50%, actually not that huge a difference. But if we drill into the data even more, we can see that that difference goes away for some demographics. White men are only about 3% less likely to graduate from college than women. Among black men, it is almost 3 times that amount. Perhaps there is a reason that black men in the US are graduating at lower rates than other populations. Reasons that have to do with the intersection of their gender and their race, rather than their gender alone. But our author instead blames, I should really find out his name, shouldn't I? Instead, our author, David J. Morris, blames video games and pornography in a classic regressive moral panic move. The thing about the whole article is that David J. Morris seems very disingenuous. He says that he is happy with more women writing, but if the gender split in terms of published authors and literary prizes were flipped, I feel like that would be considered roughly equal. It's 43% men and 57% women. That isn't that far off, but it's like the fact that when you have a panel of 5 people and 3 are men and 2 are women, it's considered equal. But the other way around, 3 women and 2 men, and the women are seen as dominating. Men, especially white men, are often seen as neutral and women are additional. The statistics on how many male and female authors there actually are differ, but a vague over 50% is most common. And women actually make up for over 50% of the population. And if he really welcomes the end of male dominance in literature, then why is he writing this article when women are only just over half of published authors and still not getting paid as well or winning all the awards? Other articles of this ilk have talked about the Costa Novel Award being 75% female, or the Rathbone Award having only 1 man out of 8 on the shortlist. This is cherry-picked data again. Of course, we all accept that historically men have dominated. Since 1969, 36 men have won the Booker and 18 women, so twice as many men. But even in recent years, it's far from equal. The most prestigious awards in the English-speaking literary world are probably the Booker and the Pulitzer Prize. Since 2015, 7 men and 4 women have won the Booker, and 2 of those women, Margaret Atwood and Bernardine Evaristo, had to share the award. Since 2015 also, 8 men and 3 women have won the Pulitzer Prize. And again, Barbara Kingsolver had to share. To make the argument that women are dominating literary fiction awards, you have to ignore the 2 most prestigious literary fiction awards, which means it's not a very strong argument. The sleight of hand from "it's women in publishing gatekeeping men from writing" to blaming the lack of books for Andrew Tate and Donald Trump is interesting. You're okay with the end of male domination in literature, but it's women's fault that men like this rise to the top. This may seem like a reach, but it is a surprisingly common reaction. Blaming women for male violence is really a common idea. And aside from that, which literary men is he reading back to that would fight against the distorted conceptions of masculinity that he talks about for Trump and Tate? Philip Roth, Norman Mailer, David Foster Wallace. Male domination of literature didn't come along with a golden age of sensitive, self-reflective, non-violent men. The whole article is poorly argued and intellectually dishonest. So I said I was going to try and be even-handed, and obviously I wasn't even-handed with the article, but with the idea that men aren't writing enough anymore, and that's a problem. The question is, are women even dominating literature? As I said, I read many articles along the lines of that one from the New York Times in my research for this video. It's a type that seems to be published every 18 months or so, decrying the lack of men writing novels. If I was a male novelist, I'd actually be quite pissed off about it. So looking into the statistics, it does seem to be true that the publishing industry is female dominated in terms of on the publishing side rather than the writing side. According to a recent UK publishers survey, 83% of marketing, 92% of publicity, and 78% of editorial staff in Britain's publishing industry are female. Taking an average of these three figures suggests an industry whose employees are 84% female. Now, this is often framed in these articles as some sort of hostile takeover, where men aren't being given the opportunities or the workplace is toxic for them. They don't see themselves in an industry and therefore don't consider it. The same sort of argument that is made about minorities and women in male-dominated workplaces or white-dominated. The evidence, however, suggests the possibility of a different argument. Perhaps men aren't being forced out, but are leaving. Two well-researched phenomena in employment are male flight and gender devaluation. When more women join an industry, men leave, and the pay goes down, making it less attractive for men to join in the future. And unlike the hostile reaction that many women face when joining a male-dominated workplace, men often experience a phenomenon known as the glass elevator, being more likely to be promoted and paid more than their female colleagues. So the reaction of men is not linked to the workplace feeling hostile, but to the workplace being devalued reputationally and monetarily when it becomes female-dominated. And since many of these articles use these anecdotes that aren't particularly well supported, let me bring in an anecdote of my own. The author Camilla Shamsi said of judging book prizes that women will bring books to the table that are by men and women equally, whereas the male judges will mostly bring books by other men. And this one is borne out by some research, which suggests that women will read roughly 50-50 male and female authors. The research is only on those two genders, whereas 81% of men will not read a book that is written by a woman. I was wrong about the statistic here. It is that of best-selling female authors, 81% of their readership is female, as opposed to best-selling male authors, where 55% of their readership is male. So men aren't reading women, but I got the stat wrong. And many will not read books with female protagonists either. It seems like the lack of men in publishing could be because of a lack of status. It's seen as a more womanly pursuit. And so it's not women meanly not publishing men, but men not wanting to be associated with women that could be the issue. And it starts young, with fathers reading to their girl children more than they read to their boy children, and the biggest indicator of whether a boy reads being whether his father does. Many articles also decried the death of the Rockstar author as the reason why men aren't writing anymore, saying that back in the 90s there were men who are household names like Martin Amis, Salman Rushdie, David Foster Wallace. All of these people were big men in the literary world. The argument goes that with the death of this cool, uncouth, louche, unconcerned male writer, the hard-drinking, tortured artist type, so too goes men's desire to become authors. It's just become so cozy now, and no young man wants to be cozy. One of the articles even mentioned John Green as a really uncool writer that no young man wants to be, which is rude. But also, John Green is writing YA. He's not trying to be Martin Amis. So it seemed an odd one to bring up. All of the articles mention Sally Rooney as the name with the most literary cachet at the moment. So perhaps as men leave the publishing industry due to lack of prestige, men aren't writing because they don't think that men aren't writing because they think that writing isn't cool anymore because women aren't cool and women are the ones doing it. I mean, I think that this argument is fairly reductive and silly, the idea that men aren't writing because it's not cool. The problem is that Sally Rooney is the only household literary fiction name. So while she could be a role model for writers of any gender, it's not like there's anyone else as famous. So it's going to just be one gender when it's only one person. I mean, I have an in real life book club with people who don't really read a lot of literary fiction. All of them know who Sally Rooney is. None of them have heard of a Tessa Moshfegh or Rachel Cusk. It's not that women have replaced men as the literary it crowd du jour, but that a literary it crowd doesn't exist. We are well aware that we live in a much more fractured media environment than we did in the 90s and early 2000s. The idea of a water cooler TV moment or even blockbuster films have all been injured by the fact that everyone is streaming now and watching things at different times. Culture is much less homogenized in the current internet age, so if studios are choosing to age down Tom Hanks rather than cast a younger actor to play him when he was younger, and all of the blockbusters are full of middle-aged men, doesn't that show you that film stars of today are not as famous as the Brat Pack was in their heyday? And so why doesn't this cultural disintegration lean over into literature as well? Homogeneity benefits the white male upper middle class writers that were the rock stars of the day, because when you have fewer sources of information, you hear the same names over and over. Whilst TikTok definitely does do the same thing and push you the same voices over and over, TikTok is not where everyone is. It's still a limited audience. In a fractured media environment, fewer people rise to the top. There is not the equivalent of a Rockstar writer these days, not because women just love being quiet and cozy, but because the only person you know is Sally Rooney. Another article that said it was young male authors that were facing the brunt of this issue, and had listed ones that people had heard of, like Douglas Stewart, Paul Mendes, and Max Porter, but said they weren't really young because they were all in their 40s. Isn't the same true for women? Aside from Sally Rooney, who, yes, is young, the other writers that we talk about are Tessa Moshfegh and Patricia Lockwood in their 40s, Rachel Cusk and Rachel Kushner in their 50s. One article even mentioned Annie Ernaux. The woman is 84. So perhaps the issue is not young male writers, but young writers in general. The average pay of an author in the UK has reduced over the last 5 years from £12,000 a year to £7,000. So whilst it was never a lucrative career, it has nearly cut by half. Perhaps that's due to the things I mentioned above: gender devaluation, cultural heterogeneation, if that's a word, but it makes a much harder industry to break into for the young and underemployed. The financial prospects of Gen Zs and millennials is a well-covered topic, but the fact that publishing houses increasingly bank on a known name, whether that is because they are already an established author or because of internet virality, it is harder for young authors to break into the system, particularly in literary fiction that doesn't have the social media cachet of romantasy or thrillers. And the research that I did suggests that there aren't actually fewer men writing, there are just more women. So it's the proportions that have changed rather than the absolute numbers. And it also suggested that perhaps these men who would have written have gone into other genres instead, other media. In the UK, men make up 84% of writers and 86% of primetime television writers. Non-fiction writing is also predominantly male, and whilst it can be harder to get a proper figure for an ad hoc medium such as podcasting, general consensus seems to be that men dominate there too. Whether it is dominating in podcasts in general or just in the financially viable ones, it does seem to be more of a male medium. So much for men no longer dictating the culture. Does it really matter that men are no longer specifically writing novels? Is the novel such an important art form? Certainly it's the art form that I engage with the most, and I suspect the same is true for writers of the articles like the ones I've mentioned. But that doesn't make it distinct in its importance. Literary fiction has never been that widely read or that important for the culture. So the panic over men reducing to as low as 43% of writers, it just seems a little overblown to me. Perhaps these men who are concerned could try reading the women who are being published. One commented that Sally Rooney isn't writing for men, for example, but loves Jonathan Franzen with some similar themes and ideas. I don't think they know how much they are telling on themselves when they belittle female writers like that. Novels, of course, do function differently from television and podcasts, and they can explore different stories or explore stories differently. But if the reason that men aren't writing is because women made it not cool and the pay isn't good enough, I don't think changing the gendered makeup of the publishing industry is really going to do a great deal about it. There is so much more that would need to change in society to bring men back to the novel. In terms of the other reason I wanted to make this video, that comment I received on my Sally Rooney video, I'm not going to put the commenter's name here because he didn't know I was going to make a video about it, and so I don't feel like it's not meant to be competitive. I just wanted to engage with this idea that working class white male writers are suffering, because classism seriously is a problem in the publishing industry. The 2014 Labour Force survey identified that 43% of people working in publishing, including those in influential editorial roles, were from middle class origins, with only 12% from working class backgrounds. I couldn't find any statistics for writers. I think because something like class is much harder, you can't objectively judge in the same way that you can for the majority of race and gender. But I did read articles by writers who do identify as working class, such as Kit DeWall and Douglas Stewart. Kit DeWall said that publishing houses only represent a partial account of the depth of variety of the working class experience, and one that is often tailored for a middle class metropolitan reader. The assumption being that working class writers and stories are marginal. They are not. More than a third of the population is from traditional working class origins. And it also assumes that in order for these stories to be commercial, they have to be filtered through a middle class sensibilities or explained for an imagined middle class reader. Now, of course, this is anecdotal, but as I said, I don't have the data. There isn't easy access to the data, but it does chime with the way that writers, Black, Asian and minority ethnic writers, talk about having to write about their perspective for an imagined white reader. And as we just discussed the income of a writer, it stands to reason that unless you have some sort of money or financial support, whether that is family money, another job, a partner who works a more well-paid job, it's unlikely you're going to be able to support yourself with writing alone. And that makes it not an attractive position for those at a financial disadvantage. In my reading for this video, there were comments that cropped up, such as in How Women Conquered the World of Fiction from The Guardian, when Charmaine Lovegrove, the founder of Dialogue Books, said, "What's really interesting is that if I'm publishing a black gay man, I'm more likely to gain traction with their voices because it's considered original and it fits the diverse voices box. Whereas if it's a white working class man, it seems to be much harder to break through." Now, again, this is an anecdote, although this is from the publisher who published Rainbow Milk, which was by a black gay man. And so she does have experience. However, I do wonder if that originality thing is important here. The black gay man book stands out because it's the only black gay man book. Not that it is literally the only one, but you know what I mean? It is much more original. It is much less published. And so the white working class narrative doesn't seem to be as well known, although it did win the Booker. And it also doesn't seem to line up with the data where white people dominate publishing, and writers such as Douglas Stewart and Andrew O'Hagan are getting traction. I do believe that the class of writers such as Stewart and O'Hagan is holding them back. I don't necessarily see the evidence for the gender too. Oftentimes, the discussion of class seems a little disingenuous in these articles. I'm not saying the commentator, just more generally, but it feels like a frame in the same way that some men will use the phrase white women to then say something very misogynistic. There are definitely issues related to white women and the use of their gender and fragility to their advantage, but in these cases I'm talking about, they're just saying something they dislike about women, but putting white in front of it to avoid the critique. In a similar way, there are major issues with class in the publishing industry, but often working class seems to only be used to talk about gripes with women publishing, rather than to genuinely engage with issues of classism. The thing they're always pointing out is women's fault, not actually class. Maybe I haven't done a good job of being even-handed as much as I had wanted to, possibly because I started with that article, and it wound me up because it was so disingenuous and it used lazy arguments to make unsupported points. And the fact is that many of these articles use the same thing, zero-sum thinking. The idea that because women are publishing more, therefore that must be bad for men, without any evidence that it actually is. And the cherry-picking of data, which happens in all of these won't somebody think of the men type articles that exist in various different pockets of culture. And they are particularly a frustrating read when they blame the lack of men publishing literary fiction for the victory of Trump, blaming women in publishing for Andrew Tate. It just doesn't make any sense. The logical leap is enormous, and the insinuation kind of gross. But I am not upset at the underlying sentiment. The idea that men maybe are reading fewer novels, and that can upset some people. If you view reading as important, then the fact that some of the population are doing it less could be upsetting. For me, I don't see the novel as sacred or like some sort of pinnacle of art to which all people should aspire. I do read a lot more than the average person, but I don't think that that is superior to someone who's really into films or plays a lot of video games. It takes a certain type of concentration that maybe is good to practice, but I haven't seen the evidence for that. And I don't think it makes society better. I am working on a video about empathy and reading and if there is actually a connection there. But I don't think that reading will make the world a kinder place, a less Trumpian place. I mean, one of the best read cultures in the world was 19th century Britain, and they weren't exactly nice to other people. Novel reading also has not always been seen as superior. Some people viewed it as fluff when we should all be reading The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire and Euclid's Geometry. What is old is always given more gravitas, so now that the novel has become old, it is seen as more important, just like the Greeks venerated the oral tradition over written poetry. My issue is that perhaps women are writing more than men, and perhaps even being recognised for their works, but I don't think that this has to be a bad thing, particularly when it's not super egregious. It's like 10%. It's not a huge number. And I think that if men could see women's writing as of similar value to men, to look up to women they admired as inspiration for them to create their own art, just like women in the past had to read men to understand how to write, then maybe we would have fewer of these articles about this slight decline in the number of men, meaning that men will never write again and it's all gone to women. The novel is a middle-aged art form, neither as old as the play or as new as short-form video content. It's not going to die out because women outnumber men. And if men valued women's writing, perhaps there wouldn't be a need to panic at all. I don't think the evidence supports the idea that it is a female-dominated publishing industry preventing men from writing. It seems that more women submit novels than men, and so therefore more novels are published. So maybe it is why men aren't writing novels that is the issue. And I'm not sure you can lay that at the feet of women. I hope this has been an interesting video. Please do let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. It is a nerve-wracking one to publish, to be perfectly honest. I'm probably going to stick to reviewing specific books in the future. If you do disagree with me though, that's fine. I would love to hear all your thoughts in the comments, as long as you are kind. Thank you very much for watching. If you are new here, my name is Roisin, and I will see you again very soon. Bye-bye.